In Leviticus 10, shortly after Moses had completed the construction of the tabernacle, we have an incident recorded for us involving Nadab and Abihu, two of Aaron's sons, and a spectacular lapse in judgment on their part in regard to the sort of sacrifice that would be acceptable in God's sight. And God used this eventuality as a teaching opportunity. Now, chances are that Nadab and Abihu didn't actually learn much from God's corrective in this incident. That is, unless they were really quick learners. But there are lessons in this text for us. Two of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, filled their censers with incense and lit them. Then, right there in the presence of the Lord, they broke faith with his commandments and offered up a pagan sacrifice of fire and smoke. Immediately they were consumed by a tongue of fire that flared out from the presence of the Lord, and in the presence of the Lord they died. Moses said to Aaron, "So this is what the Lord meant when he said, 'My holiness I will reveal in those who closest round me kneel, and thus receive by acclamation glory and honor throughout the nation.'" Aaron held his peace. Moses summoned Mishael and Elzaphan, sons of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come and take your brothers away from the sanctuary. Take them outside the camp." So they came and carried them away, holding them by their tunics. And just as Moses had ordered, they took them outside the camp. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, "You are not to pull your hair. You are not to tear your clothes. If you lose your composure, you shall lose your lives, and the Lord will lose his patience with the nation. Leave the weeping to the house of Israel. They will mourn for your brothers. They will lament the Lord's conflagration. You are not to leave the entrance to the national tabernacle. If you relinquish your stations, you shall relinquish your lives. You are the anointed ones of the Lord." They did as Moses said. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "When you and your sons come into the national tabernacle, you must be sober, having abstained from wine and intoxicants. Otherwise you too will incur mortal guilt. By law, whatever is holy must be kept separate from whatever is unholy. Whatever is clean must be kept separate from whatever is unclean. You have a responsibility to set an example for the children of Israel, to teach them the law that the Lord gave them, speaking through Moses. You must observe the law generation after generation, from now till the age to come." Now, we have all heard sermons on this text. And if I were a betting man, I'd put money on the proposition that we've all heard the same sermon on this text. Because every time I've heard this passage used in a sermon, the sermon was about the use of instrumental music in the worship service. But that isn't the sermon I'm bringing to you this morning. And just to be clear, that isn't a sermon you'll ever hear from this pulpit, not if I'm teaching from Leviticus 10. Not because I'm in support of making any kind of change to our a cappella tradition. I am not. The reason you won't hear me preach any lesson on the use of instrumental music based on Leviticus 10 is because, as I understand the matter, they have nothing to do with one another. Because the analogy between strange fire and instrumental music simply does not hold up under scrutiny. Now, to be sure, every analogy is flawed. Every analogy breaks down at some point if you extend it far enough. But the comparison between strange fire and instrumental music fails on every level going out the gate. because the sacrifice brought by Nadab and Abihu, though not specified in Leviticus 10, clearly consisted of something that God had expressly categorized as unclean. There is no implication whatsoever of the absurd notion that silence is the same as a prohibition, and that the sin of Nadab and Abihu lay in their presumption of ignoring an implied prohibition that they should have known about because God never said it. They should have known it because God never mentioned it. No, beloved, no such notion, no such idea is in evidence in Leviticus 10 or anywhere else in the Bible as far as I can tell. No, the reason silence is called silence is because it's silent. It says nothing. And anytime we imagine that silence is actually a tacit prohibition, we're doing the very thing that Paul tells us not to do. In Colossians 2:20-22, if you died with Christ to the fundamental principles of this world, why do you live as if you still belonged to the world? Why do you submit to moralizations? Touch not, taste not, handle not, all of which yield ever diminishing returns. Are these not the commands and doctrines of men? After all, what are prohibitions supposedly discerned from silence, if not men speaking for God? No, there's no mystery as to why the sacrifice brought by Nadab and Abihu was not acceptable to God, and it wasn't because they had violated the doctrines of men who presumed to speak for God where God has remained silent. No, it was because the sacrifice they brought was brought in utter defiance of things that God had expressly prohibited. First, it should be noted that the Hebrew word that I've translated pagan, but which is usually translated strange, in verse 1 of Leviticus 10, means strange in the sense of unfamiliar. But not unfamiliar as in weird, or curious, or queer, or anything like that, but unfamiliar in the sense of not of this family. Literally unfamily-ish. Remember, the word familiar comes from the word family. Strictly speaking, things that are familiar are of the family. Things that are unfamiliar are not of the family. And in Hebrew, this same word, zur, is used to refer to aliens, foreigners, or strangers. Because the people of other nations were not descended from Abraham. They were not of the family. And in terms of redemptive history, at this point in time, there were only two classes of people in the world: the people of the covenant and the people outside the covenant. The people of the family and the people not of the family. Hebrews and strangers. Hebrews and pagans. And everything that the strangers did was considered strange. But again, not because it was weird, and also not necessarily because it was bad, or wrong, or immoral. No, the designation of strangeness had nothing to do with something being moral or immoral. If it was strange, that meant that it was other than covenantal. That's why, in the passage I read earlier, I translated the word zur as pagan, rather than as strange. Because in terms of biblical categories, at this point in time, there were only two categories of religion in the world: Judaism and non-Judaism. Judaism and paganism. And all worship practices that were non-Hebrew, non-Jewish, non-Semitic, were by default pagan. So when Nadab and Abihu brought strange fire into the tabernacle, they were not introducing an innovation, into worship. It was not something unknown or untested. It was something known to God and known by them to be abhorrent to God, because God had made it just as clear as he could make it for a long time prior to this, that his people were to worship him his way. Which is why, for instance, that there was no confusion, no question. Everyone knew exactly what was meant when in Genesis 35:2, Jacob said unto his household, unto all that were with him, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean. So when Moses tells us in Leviticus 10 that the sacrifice that Nadab and Abihu brought into the tabernacle was strange, he isn't saying anything mysterious. No, he's telling us something certain, something definite. What he's telling us is that the sacrifice they brought into the house of the Lord was of a sort that they knew, and knew very well would not be acceptable to God, because he had told them so clearly and unambiguously many times prior to this. And this is confirmed by what God says in verses 10 and 11 of Leviticus 10, where he tells Aaron and his remaining sons that they have already been instructed about what is clean and what's unclean, and that it is their responsibility not just to respect the distinction between the two, but to teach the same to the children of Israel. And that's what I think is primarily at issue in Leviticus 10. Nadab and Abihu had brought into the tabernacle of the Lord a sacrifice that was both strange and unclean, and God did not approve. And though I'm sure that God was not pleased that the sacrifice they brought was strange, a pagan sacrifice, that isn't what offended him the most. No, what offended him the most was that it was unclean. And we know that because that's the offense that he names when he addresses the issue in Leviticus 9 through 11. In Matthew 12:34, Jesus tells us that from the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And that doesn't apply just to us. It applies to God as well. You want to know what's really on God's heart? Listen to what he says. And in this passage, he makes no complaint about the fact that the sacrifice Nadab and Abihu brought was strange. No, his concern is that it was unclean. Because in order for any sacrifice to be brought before the Lord, it must first be clean. And that brings us to today's lesson and the point that I want to highlight from John 15:3, where Jesus says to the apostles, you are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Because today, at long last, I'm going to tell you what I think Jesus meant when he declared the apostles to be clean. You see, a few weeks ago, I made the mistake of suggesting that what Jesus meant by that statement was that they were saved, which is a workable interpretation of this text, but highly problematic. Because as I told you last week, suggesting that all the clean are saved is just as erroneous as suggesting that all the baptized are saved. Because salvation is greater than the sum of its parts, and it's certainly greater than any one of its parts. But just as water baptism is a cause that produces an effect, the forgiveness of sins, the hearing of the word is also a cause that produces an effect. Now, we're all familiar with one of the effects of the hearing of the word, the production of faith. As Paul tells us in Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. But that isn't the effect that Jesus names in John 15:3. The effect that he names in this passage is cleanliness, the state of being clean as opposed to being unclean. And the question before us today is, What did Jesus mean when he said to the apostles that they had been made clean by the word that he had spoken to them? And the answer, at least as I understand the matter, is that the hearing of the word had made them presentable. And that because of the hearing of the word, they were then ready, at least in this one respect, to be presented to God as co-participants in the Lord's self-sacrifice. And though they had yet to believe, repent, and confess, nevertheless, once these were done, there would stand no impediment to their full and complete salvation, because they had been baptized for the forgiveness of their sins. They had been made clean. They had been made presentable by the hearing of the word. Now, if that doesn't fully compute for you, don't worry. You're not alone. Because the great majority of Christians I've known struggle to understand the Old Testament concepts of clean and unclean, on which I think John 15:3 is based. Because we tend to think of clean and unclean in terms of those realities corresponding roughly with righteous and unrighteous, or with good and evil, or with pure and impure in a moral sense. But that is most decidedly not what clean and unclean mean. Nevertheless, this understanding of these realities persists, and I think largely because of a fundamental misunderstanding we have of the Mosaic covenant and the purpose of covenant law. After all, how many times have you heard Christian apologists make the claim that were it not for the covenant law of the Old Testament, we would not know right from wrong, good from evil, righteousness from unrighteousness? I hear that all the time. Were it not for the Bible, were it not for the law of God, were it not for the 10 Commandments, the world would have no baseline for understanding right from wrong. After all, the law of Moses is the foundation stone upon which the laws of society and our modern legal system are based. Well, it may be true at the core, that the core of the law of Moses serves as one of the primary sources of our modern law. That is a lineage that can be traced out historically and demonstrated factually. But it's absolutely not true that covenant law, or even the Bible, stands as the basis of our knowledge of right and wrong. I mean, it's not like people didn't know that murder, adultery, theft, and lying under oath were wrong until God told Moses so 3,500 years ago on the top of Mount Sinai. No, as I've pointed out in many a sermon, the source of our knowledge of good and evil is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Paul tells us in Romans 1 that basic knowledge of good and evil, basic knowledge of right and wrong, is the common possession of all humankind. Now, yes, as we go along in life, our knowledge and sensibilities are informed and refined. But the foundational knowledge of right and wrong is written on the human heart from the get-go. Now, Paul also tells us in that same chapter, and again in chapter 5 of Romans, that it is the universal tendency of human beings to suppress that knowledge in favor of depravity, which is why we need laws in human society, and why every culture in every time, in every place, has had to develop a system of law, a system of justice. And that's why every system of law has at its core a basic set of principles very similar to the 10 Commandments. Because the problem of sin is universal. And even though, as Paul tells us in Romans 1:30, people are constantly inventing new ways to do evil, the core sins that seem to entangle people aren't all that different from place to place and from age to age. Knowledge of evil is the common possession of all humankind, and it isn't the law of Moses that makes that so. What the law does, according to Paul in Romans 7:13, is to bring evil into stark relief, in contrast to good. That is, the law makes sin more apparent, bringing back to light that which we, because of our sinful nature, tend to try to suppress and obscure. Now, why am I bringing that up this morning? What does that have to do with today's lesson? Well, simply this. If the primary purpose of the law is not to inform us of good and evil, if the primary purpose of the commandments of God is not to inform us of right and wrong, then the most important words in the law of God cannot be shalt and shalt not. I get a lot of messages from people with links to one thing or another, and these tend to come in clusters. If one friend sends me a certain link, chances are it won't be long before I'm getting that same or similar link from lots of friends. And one such link that I get that comes around in waves once every 4 or 5 years is the one about the hillbilly 10 Commandments, which claims to boil down the 10 Commandments to their bare essentials by rephrasing them in Appalachian vernacular. So, for example, various ones of the commandments are rendered, no telling tales or gossiping, no fooling with another feller's gal, quit your foul mouthing, no swiping your kinfolk's stuff, and don't be hankering for it neither. Now, this sort of thing really annoys me. Not just because it's vain in its attempt to be amusing, or because it makes something of a mockery of the 10 Commandments, but also, and more importantly, because the author of this parody has completely missed the point of the 10 Commandments, because he or she has imagined that the most important aspect of the Decalogue lies in its imperatives and its prohibitions, in the shouts and the shalt nots. But this is about as far off the mark as you can get and still be right in the right shooting gallery. Because as I understand the matter, the most important word in the 10 Commandments is the word thou. I have a dear friend in Wichita, Clarence Wallace, who is an elder at the West Douglas Church of Christ. And one time Clarence told me the story of the most important words that his father ever said to him. You see, when Clarence turned 18, he was drafted to go into the military straight out of high school. And when the day came for him to leave home and report for duty, his father drove him to the train station. Now, Clarence's father wasn't a man of many words, and he wasn't given to sentimentality. But Clarence knew that that day his father had something he wanted to tell him before he left home for the first time and possibly for the last time. So when they arrived at the station, Clarence lingered in the car to give his father the opportunity to say what he wanted to say to him. And after a few moments, his father cleared his throat and turned to him and said, "Just remember, son, you're a Wallace." And as far as Clarence was concerned, that was all he needed to say. That said it all, because it summed up a lifetime of living and doing and being what his family had taught him by their lives and examples about what to be and how to be and who to be. And that's what God is communicating to the children of Israel in the 10 Commandments. In Exodus 6:7, God instructs Moses to say to the children of Israel, I will be your God and you will be my people. And he starts the Ten Commandments by stating that he has fulfilled the first half of that statement. Exodus 22, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And the rest of the Ten Commandments is dedicated to telling the children of Israel how it is that they're to hold up their end of the relationship. Exodus 22 through 17, I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any graven images, and you shall not bow down to them or worship them. You shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. On it you shall do no work. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet. The primary purpose of the Ten Commandments is not to inform the children of Israel about the difference between right and wrong. They knew the difference. Everybody does, at least on a fundamental level. No, the primary purpose of the Ten Commandments is to codify the identity of the children of Israel as the people of God. I am your God, and you are my people, and as my people, I have certain expectations of you. Now, as it turns out, all of the Ten Commandments have a moral component to them. They're all moral imperatives for God-fearing people. But remember, the Ten Commandments are only the beginning of the law, the foundation of the law. All in all, there are 613 commandments in the Old Testament, and many of them involve moral imperatives, but just as many and more do not. I mean, after all, what's immoral about being clean-shaven? Or wearing a garment made of two kinds of cloth? Or sowing different kinds of seed together in one field? It may be foolish, but it's not immoral. What's immoral about eating fish that swim in schools? Or getting a mohawk? Or eating meat together with dairy? And where's the moral imperative in wearing tassels on the corners of one's clothing, or in giving thanks after meals, or in abstaining from eating shellfish? These are not commandments of morality. These are commandments of identity. In none of these cases is the operative or most important word in the commandment shout or shout not. No, in all of these cases, the most important word is the word thou, the word you. I am the Lord your God, and you are my people, and you shall follow my commandments. And you can go to any of the 613 commandments given in the Old Testament, and you'll find that they all have one thing in common. They're all directed to the people of God. They were never intended to be universal. They were never intended as moral guidance for all of humankind. I mean, take a look, for instance, at the texts that prohibit the children of Israel from eating shellfish. Leviticus 11, 9 through 12. These you may eat of all that are in the waters, whatever has fins and scales in the waters, in the seas, and in the rivers, these you may eat. But all that have not fins and scales in the seas and in the rivers, of all the creeping things in the waters, and of all the living creatures which are in the waters, they are to be considered an abomination and abhorrence to you. They shall be an abomination to you. Altogether, you shall not eat of their flesh, and you shall detest their carcasses. Everything in the waters that has not fins or scales shall be abhorrent and detestable to you. And again in Deuteronomy 14:9-10, these you may eat of all that are in the waters. Whatever has fins and scales you may eat, but whatever has not fins and scales you may not eat. It is unclean for you. God never says that eating shellfish is inherently immoral. What he says to the children of Israel is, you, who are adherents to the covenant of Moses, shall not do it. What he says to his people is that lobster, as well as crabs, sharks, sea turtles, starfish, clams, and octopuses, Greek, not Latin, shall be unclean to you. And if you eat of them, they will make you unclean. But as far as I can tell, God couldn't care less whether or not the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, or any other kind of ite eat seafood that is bereft of fins and or scales. And why not? Well, I think it's because there is nothing wrong with eating such food, and there never has been. And doing so will do no harm whatsoever to these strangers, because they are already unclean. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that God is indifferent to lawlessness or sin among the elect, or outside the elect, except among the elect. He is not, and the Bible couldn't be more clear about that. What I am saying, however, is that the law of the Old Covenant was not given to the children of Israel for their moral instruction. God wasn't instructing them about how to be good people. He was instructing them about how to be good Jews, about how to be good keepers of his covenant. And part of being a good adherent to the covenant of Moses was learning what one had to do to be made clean, that is, to be made presentable before the Lord. In a way, I suppose it's kind of like basic training. If you join the armed forces and you're already a good person, that and a $5 bill will get you a cup of coffee. Because the military isn't concerned primarily with producing good people. The main objective of basic training is to produce good soldiers. Because being a good soldier is an identity. It is the identity the military wants you to have. And there are all kinds of things that go into making a good soldier that have nothing to do with being a good person. And one of those things is the willingness, readiness, and ability to make oneself presentable before the CO in short order. Cleaned, pressed, buttoned up, and collared, shoes shined to a mirror finish. That isn't just a matter of discipline. It isn't just a matter of respect. It's a matter of identity. That's what it means to be clean. That's what it means to be presentable. In the military, basic training is the cause that produces the effect of presentability. In the covenant of Moses, adherence to the law and all that it prescribes is the cause that produces the effect of presentability. In the new covenant, hearing the word is the cause that produces the effect of presentability. That's the effect that Jesus told the apostles in John 15:3 that the hearing of the word had wrought in them. Just as water baptism is a cause that produces an effect that has value in and of itself, the forgiveness of sins, so also the hearing of the word is a cause that produces an effect that has its value in and of itself. It makes one clean, in the sense that it makes one presentable before the Lord. Perhaps that is at least part of the meaning of the prophecy of Malachi 3:3. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. According to Jesus, in John 15:3, the apostles were made clean. They were purified. They were made presentable before the Lord, that they might offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. Now, that brings us to the end of our studies on John 15:3. Next week, we'll return to the questions presented to us in Acts 10 about what constitutes salvation and how baptism fits into that schemata of salvation, which discussion will, before we're finished with that passage, yield answers to any questions you may have, for instance, about the efficacy of pedobaptism, child baptism, versus cradobaptism, believer's baptism. And that's where we'll pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.